The morning light arrives slowly over the backyard, stretching across a quiet wooden fence and a bird feeder that has not been touched in days. The air feels familiar at first, the kind of stillness you expect from an ordinary early morning in a suburban yard, where nothing should feel out of place. A light breeze moves through the branches of a maple tree, barely enough to shift a single leaf, and somewhere in the distance a faint bird call breaks the silence like it always does. But something about today feels slightly different. The feeder, once a small center of constant motion, now hangs untouched, its surface still and almost unfamiliar in the way it reflects the morning light. On the first day after you stopped refilling it, nothing dramatic happened. The birds still came, as if following memory rather than necessity. But now, as days have quietly passed into nearly a week and beyond, the rhythm has begun to shift in a way that is almost too subtle to name. You notice fewer sudden movements at the edges of your vision, fewer quick flashes of wings between branches, and more moments where the yard simply holds its breath. If you are new here, take a moment to subscribe before you continue, because what unfolds in places like this is not just about birds, but about patterns of memory and presence that most people walk past without ever noticing. And once you begin to see it, you may never look at a quiet backyard the same way again. But what makes this silence feel unusual is not what is missing, but what still remains, as if something unseen is continuing to observe the space where activity used to be, waiting for a signal that no longer comes, and that is where things begin to feel slightly off. As though the yard itself is remembering something you have already started to forget. And yet, even in this stillness, there are faint signs that not everything has truly left. There is a strange kind of recognition that begins to form when you spend enough time looking at the same quiet space, like a backyard that once felt full of life but now seems to pause longer than it should between moments of movement. You might not notice it at first, but there is a shift in how you begin to pay attention, as if your mind is waiting for something familiar to return even when nothing obvious is missing. The absence does not feel loud. It feels almost polite, like something that stepped away without asking for attention but still left an impression behind. And if you have ever watched a feeder slowly lose its constant visitors over a stretch of days, you know this feeling in a way that is hard to explain but easy to recognize once it happens. You tell yourself at first that it is normal, that birds move on, that patterns change with weather or time or nothing in particular. But even as you think that, you still find yourself glancing out the window a little more often than usual, expecting motion where there is none. And that is something many people quietly experience without ever putting words to it. The way a space can feel slightly different when a routine presence stops appearing in it. The way silence can begin to feel structured instead of empty. If you are new here, you might want to subscribe before going further, because this is not just about what happens in a backyard, but about noticing the small shifts that most people dismiss until they realize they have been part of them all along. And once that awareness begins, it is difficult to ignore how often life leaves behind traces of patterns that continue even after the obvious connection seems to fade, as if something in the environment is still holding onto a rhythm you are no longer actively maintaining. And that quiet persistence is where the next change begins to reveal itself. By the time you notice it, the change is no longer about whether the birds are coming or not, but about how they come, as if the entire rhythm of the backyard has been quietly rewritten without asking for permission. Early in the mornings, you still find yourself glancing toward the same familiar branches, the same fence line, the same small feeder hanging motionless in the air. But now the expectation feels different, less certain, more observational, like you are watching something that used to participate with you but is now simply passing through its own schedule. A chickadee appears first, as it often does, but instead of the quick, confident arrival you remember, it pauses at a distance, holding still for a moment longer than usual, as if checking something invisible before deciding whether to move closer. A cardinal follows later, not landing immediately, but circling once around the edge of the yard, touching the same branch it used to land on without hesitation, then leaving again as if completing a quiet confirmation rather than an action. Even the sparrows, which once filled the feeder in small restless waves, now arrive in scattered moments that feel less like feeding and more like testing. And it is in these small behavioral shifts that something deeper begins to emerge, something that does not announce itself but becomes harder to ignore with each passing day, as though the yard is still being visited by something that remembers what it used to be, even if it no longer responds in the same way. The feeder itself remains unchanged in form, but its meaning seems to have shifted, becoming less of a destination and more of a reference point, something the birds acknowledge without fully engaging with. And what makes this even more noticeable is that none of it feels random anymore, because there are patterns within the absence, repetitions within the distance, moments where the same bird returns at nearly the same time only to hesitate in the same way, as if replaying a memory that no longer produces the same outcome. It is subtle, almost easy to dismiss, but once you begin to see it, it feels like stepping into a version of the backyard that exists just slightly out of sync with what you remember, and that quiet distortion is where the story begins to reveal that something about this place is still being recognized, even when it is no longer being actively used. What makes this shift harder to dismiss is that it does not feel like something breaking, but rather something recalibrating, as if the backyard itself is adjusting to a new set of expectations that were never spoken out loud. When the chickadees return now, their behavior carries a kind of precision that feels almost structured, not in an artificial way, but in the quiet logic of repetition and memory. Research from long-term observational studies at places like the Cornell Lab of Ornithology has shown that small backyard birds such as chickadees and sparrows do not simply react to food. They build what scientists describe as spatial and temporal memory maps of reliable feeding locations, remembering not only where resources exist but when they tend to appear. This is not abstract intelligence, but lived pattern recognition, built through repetition over days and weeks, sometimes even after interruptions. In that context, what you are witnessing is not absence followed by random return, but a kind of behavioral testing, as if the birds are checking whether the pattern they once trusted still holds in any form. A chickadee pausing at a familiar branch is not hesitation without meaning. It is a moment of comparison between expectation and current reality. Even the brief visits from cardinals or sparrows begin to make more sense when viewed through this lens, because what looks like uncertainty is often a form of recalibration, a way of measuring whether a known environment still matches the memory stored within it. And when you consider that many birds can remember feeding sites for extended periods even with inconsistent reinforcement, the repeated returns begin to feel less like coincidence and more like persistence of internal maps that have not yet fully updated. In that quiet space between memory and change, the backyard stops being just a physical place and starts behaving like a system still trying to resolve what it remembers against what is now actually there. There is a subtle way the backyard begins to feel less like a place you are observing and more like a place that is quietly aware of your presence, not in any dramatic sense, but in the accumulation of small returning details that begin to feel personal when you notice them long enough. You find yourself standing near the window at the same time each morning without planning to, watching the same corner of the fence where movement used to happen more frequently, and even though you tell yourself you are simply checking the weather of the yard, there is something more intimate forming beneath that habit. A chickadee lands closer than before, not rushing toward the feeder, but pausing on a thin branch just a few feet from where you stand, turning its head in small, precise motions as if measuring the space between you and it in ways that feel strangely deliberate. A cardinal appears later, settling on the edge of the yard in a way that feels less like arrival and more like acknowledgement, holding still just long enough for you to notice its presence before shifting away into the branches again. Even the sparrows, though less structured in their movements, begin to create brief overlapping moments where their paths bring them close enough that you can hear the soft flutter of wings cutting through the morning air. And somewhere in this repetition, a sense of quiet familiarity begins to form, as if the yard is no longer just responding to food or absence, but to a shared rhythm that has not fully dissolved even after the feeder stopped being actively maintained. You may not say it out loud, but there is a growing awareness that these small visits are not random interruptions in silence, but part of something slower and more continuous, something that still includes you even when you are not directly participating in it. And that realization begins to change the way even the quietest mornings feel when you stand there and wait. By now, the backyard no longer feels like a simple cycle of arrivals and departures, but like something that is slowly expanding beyond its original boundaries, as if every small visit carries more weight than it used to. The quiet spaces between bird movements are longer, but they are no longer empty in the way they once were, because you start to notice what happens inside them. A chickadee no longer just lands and leaves, it pauses in midair for a fraction of a second longer before choosing its branch, as if something invisible is being checked before each decision. A cardinal that used to stay at the edge of the yard now moves slightly deeper into the space, not closer to the feeder, but closer to the places where you usually stand, holding still for moments that feel almost observational rather than instinctive. Even the sparrows begin to behave differently in groups, sometimes arriving in uneven timing patterns that feel less coordinated by food and more by something that resembles shared awareness of presence. And as these changes accumulate, the yard begins to feel larger in meaning, not in size, as if it is no longer just responding to absence, but actively reorganizing itself around what remains familiar. There is a growing sense that the birds are not simply returning to a forgotten routine, but are instead tracing the outline of something that still exists even without direct reinforcement, something that does not disappear just because attention has shifted away from it. It becomes harder to define where behavior ends and recognition begins, because the repetition of these small encounters starts to feel like confirmation rather than coincidence, as if the system itself is still trying to resolve a pattern that has not fully closed. And in that unresolved space, you begin to wonder whether what you are witnessing is not the fading of interaction, but the continuation of something that never entirely depended on constant participation to exist, and that question lingers quietly as the next return approaches without warning. There is a moment, somewhere between the familiar rhythm of early morning and the quiet return of scattered movement in the yard, where the experience begins to feel less like observation and more like participation in something you do not fully understand. You are no longer simply watching birds come and go. You are noticing how their presence seems to respond to something beyond food or routine, as if the space itself carries an invisible memory that continues to influence how they move through it. Many people believe that animals operate purely on instinct, reacting only to immediate conditions. But when you spend enough time with these subtle patterns, it becomes difficult to ignore the possibility that there is something more layered happening beneath the surface. A chickadee landing near the same branch where it once hesitated now feels less like repetition and more like recognition, as if the location itself holds meaning that persists even when conditions have changed. A cardinal appearing at the edge of the yard and pausing in stillness feels less like caution and more like awareness of continuity, as though it is confirming something that still exists even in altered form. Something about this begins to feel difficult to dismiss, not because it demands belief, but because it repeats itself in ways that feel consistent over time. You may find yourself standing a little longer at the window, not expecting anything specific, but sensing that the yard is still part of a system that has not fully resolved itself. And in that quiet awareness, there is a growing impression that what you are witnessing is not simply the fading of a feeding routine, but the continuation of an unseen connection between place, memory, and presence, something that does not disappear just because the visible interaction has changed. And that realization lingers softly as the next small movement begins to form just beyond the edge of sight. There comes a point in the morning when everything slows down just enough for you to realize that you are no longer looking for change, but simply sitting with what has already changed. The yard feels quieter now, but not empty, more like it has settled into a version of itself that no longer depends on constant movement to feel alive. A chickadee lands briefly on a branch near the feeder, not rushing, not testing, just arriving and remaining still for a moment longer than usual, as if there is no urgency left to its presence. A cardinal appears in the distance, holding its position at the edge of the fence line, turning slightly but not committing to approach, and in that stillness there is something almost contemplative, as if it is no longer measuring food or safety, but simply acknowledging the space as it is. Even the sparrows, when they pass through, do so with less noise than before, their movement blending into the background like a pattern that no longer needs to announce itself to be understood. And in these quiet intervals, something subtle begins to settle, within your own awareness as well. A kind of calm recognition that nothing here is truly gone, only transformed into something less visible and more patient. You find yourself no longer expecting sudden arrival or disappearance, but instead accepting the slower rhythm that has taken its place, where presence is measured not by activity but by the quiet persistence of return. The backyard, in its stillness, feels almost complete in a way that is difficult to explain, as if everything that has happened is still happening in a softer form, just beneath the surface of attention. And in that soft space between observation and understanding, there is a final sense that what you have been witnessing is not an ending, but a quiet continuation of something that does not require constant movement to remain real. There is a final kind of stillness that arrives without announcement, not as an ending, but as a settling, like the backyard has finally exhaled after holding its breath for too long. The feeder still hangs in the same place, unchanged in form, but no longer carrying the same weight of expectation it once did. You notice that you are not waiting in the same way anymore. You are simply observing. A chickadee appears one last time, not with hesitation, not with urgency, but with a quiet familiarity that feels almost like acknowledgement. It lands briefly, turns its head toward the space where movement used to matter more, and then leaves without hurry. A cardinal follows at a distance, pausing at the edge of the fence line just long enough for the morning light to catch its shape before it slips back into the trees. Even the sparrows, scattered and soft, pass through without forming the patterns you once expected. And in this absence of repetition, something unexpected settles in its place. A sense that nothing here was ever truly lost, only carried forward in a different way. The yard does not feel empty. It feels remembered. And perhaps that is what has been unfolding all along. Not the disappearance of connection, but its transformation into something quieter, something that no longer needs constant motion to exist.
Thank you for staying with me until the very end of this story. If moments like these leave you with a strange sense of wonder about the world around you, be sure to subscribe before you go, because there are still countless things happening all around us that we pass by every day without ever truly seeing. And perhaps tonight, when you glance out your window, there will be a small, quiet moment that reminds you of something simple, yet profound. Sometimes the things we believe have already ended are simply continuing in a different way, one we haven't yet found the words to describe.